Tēnā nō tātou, no mai hoki mai. Just want to mihi to you all for your responses there, and particularly mihi to Heri Aroha. If it was up to me, I'd still be answering the first question. So thank you. We can get a lot through in the 30 seconds. So I do want to respond where I can to some of the comments and questions that came out. Firstly, around intersectionality. So in the survey, we did ask for gender identity and gave a set of options and then a space for those to self-identify using their own words if they wish. And you'll appreciate in a survey, we do wānanga every question and have to really rationalise for every question to be in there, in the knowledge that it is a time burden on our respondents. So every question that's in there is in there deliberately. The question around gender identity is largely so that everyone has the right to identify. But also in the knowledge that we wouldn't get high enough numbers of the different groups to do a different analysis. So for this particular survey, we don't have the numbers to analyse for the different gender or sexual groups, but the question was in there because we have the right to identify ourselves how we choose. Yeah. And like I mentioned, we're sort of hot off the back of doing the research on the Honour Project Aotearoa, which explored that a lot further and does do some analysis by the different gender groups, not particularly on violence, as in this one here. So that sort of responds, hopefully, enough to that question. Another thing that came out, somebody talked about phrases that come out on social media and talked of that term, unapologetically Māori, and oh my gosh, that's one of my pet peeves too. We have nothing to apologise about, and we don't have to apologise about not apologising too. So we are Māori, that's it. And a number of comments talked about how, there was some surprise at those who said, no, I don't experience Māori. Don't experience racism, violence, etc. And yeah, I think we should be surprised and think about that a little bit more. Again, because of the numbers, we can't drill down into it in this survey, but it does make us think a bit. And so there was some kōrero around, how we've become desensitised perhaps to some of the violences that impact us, how we've become numbed, how we have automatic defence mechanisms, if you like, because we just can't take on every single one of those hits, can we? And Karina Walters, a researcher in the States, talks a lot about microaggressions. So these little violences that hit us, they're micro in that they can be fleeting, but not micro in the impact that they have on us. Moana Jackson talks about, similarly, microcolonisations. So we're exposed to these microcolonisations all the time, on a daily basis. We have mechanisms to protect ourselves from these microcolonisations. And I just hark back to the slide where we had that question, how much does state violence impact on your life? And the answers for yes were similar to the answers for no. Yes, it does. And this is how and why, and this is what I do to minimise it. No, it doesn't, and this is what I do to minimise it. So it shows, I think, how we've internalised some of those or normalised some of those practices to defend ourselves, to protect ourselves, our mana, our mauri, from those hits. Yeah. And there was some kōrero and some questions around being somebody who's white passing Māori and how that can be in some ways how difficult it is to be Māori, but also how you can be in a position of advocacy. And I think the word used over here, power to be staunch in that space. I guess for myself, I have a very Pākehā sounding name, Shirley Simmonds, and I know throughout my lifetime it's afforded me some privilege and protection I would not have had had I had an ingoa Māori, much as I, throughout my lifetime, wished for one. And the other thing that I think came up in the question and comment space there is how much we need to call out state violence. And it was, for me, it was particularly interesting doing this project and teasing apart the different types of violences, and then you get a picture of how much it is out there and what it looks like in its different forms and shapes. One of the questions in the break somebody came up to me with was, did we look at sexism by the state? And no, we didn't, and that would be really interesting to look at. So how sexism is facilitated through state and state agencies. And the example given was, for example, at WINS, a single father is treated differently from a single mother. So that would be an interesting study. One of the things about research is it always brings up other potential research. So any of you are keen on exploring any of these, grab those whakaaro while they're out there. But I do, the need for calling it out, the need for identifying it, the need for really showing what these violences look like and not accepting it. And teaching our tamariki and mokopuna too what it looks like and not accepting it as well, I think is really important. Okay. I think if I didn't quite respond to any of your questions, hit me up later. Kia ora. Nō reira, hoi tonu, tēnei waka. And wanted to pause a little bit on the name, and I know Leonie spoke about the name for this project, I'm reluctant to call it project now, where's Graham? This kaupapa, he waka eke noa, and that there's the concept of collectivism and communalism in it. We're all in this waka. And I think if we dig down deeper to it, Leonie mentioned we can all hoi. And Graham talked about we all, have a contribution. Aha ko iti, aha ko rahi. We all have a contribution to make to ensuring this waka goes forward. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that we all have a part to play. For me, it comes with a responsibility. There's a responsibility to contribute to that waka going forward. Okay, I'm not so good at So moving on through our survey, the next section was on, we termed Mauri ora to align with He Koro Wai Oranga framework. These are the experiences of the individual. The first set of questions we asked about individual having experiences, having seen or witnessed different types of violences, and then the next set of questions asked about personal experiences. And then a set of questions asking who perpetrated this violence. And I do want to pause there for a moment and think back to Marama's words yesterday about perpetrators, that yes, they must be held accountable, but also they have healing too, they have traumas too. And this, us, the system must serve to address those as well. And again, we had quite a in-depth definition of violence, interpersonal violence in this instance. So these are the definitions we came up with and the examples, again, very carefully thought through, and they were given in the questionnaire. So the person responding to the question got that deeper understanding of the different types of violence. So physical, examples given such as pushing, hitting, use of weapons, someone being forced to take alcohol or drugs. Psychological, emotional and spiritual, such as someone constantly being put down and criticised, being humiliated, threatened, having someone or something they love threatened. Deprivation or neglect, such as someone not being provided food, clothing or warmth, comfort or love, medical treatment, or being left with someone who is unsafe. Sexual, such as someone being touched in a way they don't want, forced to watch pornography, forced to do sexual acts, raped, forced prostitution, or frequently being accused of sleeping with others. Financial deprivation, such as someone having their money or property taken, having debts run up in their name, being pressured into paying money. Online, such as bullying, stalking, threats, racist comments, hate speech, homophobia. and denigration of whakapapa, which is a psychological, emotional, and spiritual abuse. So again, you see quite an in-depth definition, and we have separate questions for each type of violence in here. So again, to interpret this graph, the dark bars are where the experiences are a lot, medium, a few times, and the light bars at the bottom, never. The question here was, in your lifetime, how often have you seen or witnessed the following types of violence? And a point to note here, all the way through the survey, we gave respondents the option to skip if they felt the question was too taumaha. Again, I was having a conversation in the break. Most didn't, to be honest. And I think probably the lower number of responses we got was about 1,300, as in this case. So most still persisted and answered. How often have you seen or witnessed the following types of violence? First one, physical, and 41.7% said a lot. Just 6.4% said never, have never seen or witnessed physical violence. Psychological, emotional, and spiritual. Just under 60% said a lot, and just around 3% said had never. So 97% said they have witnessed psychological, emotional, and spiritual violence. Deprivation or neglect, just over a third said a lot. Around 20% said they've never witnessed this. Witnessing sexual violence, over 20% said a lot. Around half said a few times, and just under 30% stated never. Financial deprivation, about a third said a lot, 45% said a few times, and 23% said never seen or witnessed financial deprivation. Online violence, around 40% said a lot, 44% said a few times, and 16% stated never having seen or witnessed online violence. And denigration of whakapapa, around 40% said yes, have seen or witnessed this a lot, around 45%, 46%, a few times, and 14% never. The next question asked about experiencing these types of violence. And just want to note, actually, for this one, I'm not entirely sure what happened. I think it was something with the platform we used, but the question around denigration of whakapapa fell off, unfortunately. But in your lifetime, how often have you experienced the following types of violence? Physical, around 25% said a lot, and just 17% said never. Psychological, emotional, and spiritual, 40% said a lot, and just 9% said never. Deprivation or neglect was about half and half. Yep. Just under 50% said they'd never experienced this. 14% stated a lot. Sexual violence, experience of sexual violence, about a third stated they have never experienced this. About over half stated they have a few times, and around 13% stated they have experienced this a lot. Financial deprivation, experience of financial deprivation, around a half stated they have never experienced this. Around 11% stated they have experienced this a lot. And experience of online violence, around 43% stated never. 46% stated a few times, and 11% stated a lot. In terms of experience of violence, like I say, we asked each type of violence question and then followed it up with by whom. This data presents the one that got the most frequent responses at the top here, and the top 5, if you like. So who was it you experienced violence from in terms of physical violence, family member such as older family member, so we separated that out. Family member older, family member younger. For example, parent, partner, current at that time. Bearing in mind, we're asking about lifetime experience. So we had to kind of position it in terms of time. Stranger, about 12% stated a complete stranger. Partner previous at that time, 10%. And family member younger, such as child or mokopuna, just under 6%. That's for physical violence. Who was it that you experienced psychological, emotional and spiritual violence from? Family member older, about 20% of those who experience violence experienced it from an older family member. Partner previous at the time, workmate, stranger, friend. Who was it that you experienced deprivation or neglect from? Family member older. So of those who experienced deprivation or neglect, just over a third stated family member or older. Person you met online, which I think is an interesting one. When you think about relationships facilitated online and the power they can have, about just under 20%. Family member younger, such as child or mokopuna, just under 10 or 9%. Partner previous at the time, 6%, and other. I haven't got it on my notes, but I think what was mentioned here, might have been here, but somewhere, or maybe in financial. Don't quote me, but it'll be in the final report. But what was mentioned somewhere in here were loan shark organisations. And I think that's something that should be examined. And banks. A quote was made around illegal fees from banks, you know. So in terms of, actually it might have been financial, but I'll just earmark that anyway. So some comments came up in this question here. I think it's easy for us to blame individuals when in fact the issue is systemic. I would say that our education welfare system has contributed to this deprivation. While it's easy for us to point the finger at whānau individuals, I would argue that it is the system that is broken, i.e. the colonial Western ideology, which is the greatest oppressor in terms of deprivation or neglect. Who was it that you experienced sexual violence from? So of those who did experience sexual violence, about 20% family member older, 16% partner previous at the time, 15% stranger, which I think is a number that interests me. I'm looking around the room because I know a lot of you have more experience in the field than I do, but I know some time ago, you know, back in the 70s, 80s, stranger danger was promoted as something to be careful of, and then it was kind of promoted that it's not always strangers. It can be somebody you know or somebody in the whānau, and this stat shows that actually there's a fair amount that occurs from strangers. Other, and aroha mai, I don't have the data there, but friend of a friend. Aroha mai. Financial deprivation. So experiencing financial deprivation from partner who was previous at that time, so an ex-partner still having a financial hold over an individual, 30%. Family member older, such as parent, partner current at that time, friend and other. So in this one, in the other section, like I mentioned earlier, loan sharks, debt schemes, online scams, banks that charge illegal fees. And this is an interesting one. It just was one comment that came up, but I thought it was worth highlighting. Donating to charities puts a lot of pressure on me too. People are in need, so I give, but I am in need also. I think that's, you know, you think about our expression of manaakitanga and how we're compelled to do it, despite the fact we're in need as well. That's what that comment reflects to me. Online violence from a stranger, friend of a friend, and, social media, they're friends with inverted commas, I think. Person you met online, partner previous at the time, and other in that order. So in the other category, was just stated acquaintances, current and previous, some strangers. But a comment was made around strangers commenting on pro-Māori posts on Facebook with racist rhetoric that rapidly becomes personal. So even with positive stories and positive posts, they can become and do become negative. So that was experiences of the individual, both witnessing the different types of violences and experiencing it, and a bit of an insight as to by whom. The next section of the survey asks around support and support services. When you experience violence, where do you get support? So of those who experienced any types of violence, so they're all lumped into one here, the different types that we teased out, this is where we got support. And respondents could choose more than one answer. So we got 1,624 people, respondents in this question, and 3,393 responses, because they could pick more than one answer. So out on top came whānau and friends. So something to think about there. When you experience violence, where do you get support? I think about who do we trust? I think about who do we have access to, immediate access to, but I also think about how supported are our whānau to support those who experience violence. And I know in the last day or so we've talked a bit about arming ourselves with information. I think that, just something to think about. And again, I'm conscious that a lot of you in the room have been in this field a lot and will know a lot more than I do, but just some thoughts to throw out there. Next up, we're counsellor, which again is interesting, accessing a counsellor, 291 responses there. The next one in line there was, I didn't get support. So ka aroha. In the break today at Morning Tea, we were talking a little bit about that, the sense of whakamā, that's a huge barrier to us seeking support, but also the whakamā that the state can impose on us that adds to our whole, dare I say, kiti of whakamā that becomes that huge barrier to reaching out. Doctor, GP, workmates, Māori provider, 163 responses, traditional healer, 160 responses, which shows to me the huge importance of that role, that we're there and available for our whānau. Mental health services, police 111 number. Other, I do have the other here. Women's refuge, church, online support, neighbour, mainstream provider, police 105 number, which has only been in place since May 2019, and Takatapui or LGBTQI plus networks. So they're all lined up in order of the number of times an individual's reached out. Yeah, I think that's some interesting data. In terms of other, which 123 people stated, some specific services were mentioned, such as Alcoholics Anonymous, 12-step recovery group, EAP, rape crisis, and so on. But also a number of people mentioned taking care of their own health, so the importance of self-care and things like connecting to the taiao, things like returning home to the marae to reground yourself. So again, I think, how are we supported to care for ourselves? How are we supported to care for our whānau? So for those who stated, I didn't get support, we asked, what are the reasons you didn't get support? Fear, whakamā, distrust. So this is a broad brush thematic analysis of the responses. Who do you trust to share your story? Normalization, acceptance, self-blame, internalization, it's a part of life. lack of services, expensive, not sure where to go. And this is a quote that stands out for me. Remembering we only had 17% of the respondents in this survey who identified as male. I'm a male and there are no supports for males. Solace in te ao Māori. Kua hoki au ki ngā taonga ākoro mā a kui mā. And as I indicated before, this came up a lot. The healing power of our tikanga and our reo, our whenua, awa, moana, maunga. Okay. The final section of the survey was pai ora, or that of aspirational well-being. So we asked participants around strategies to minimise violence. Have they made the decision to be violence-free? And factors for healing, health of whānau, for healthy futures. And our richness of data came out in this. So not just numbers, but lots of free text questions. So the first question, are there things you do to minimise violence in your life? Of those, about 84% responded yes. Again, a thematic analysis. Avoidance, boundaries, isolating, safe spaces. Keep to myself. Being clear about the kawa of our whānau. Vigilance, hypervigilance, and limiting or abstaining from alcohol. So alcohol was mentioned a number of times. Drugs, not a huge amount, but was mentioned. But mostly alcohol, the impact of alcohol on maintaining safe spaces. Be aware of my surroundings. And we heard that in the kōrero, I think, from Denise yesterday. Whanaungatanga and the importance of connections. So maintain strong relationships with positive whānau and friends. Advocacy, education, dig my heels in for what is right. And again, as I mentioned earlier, a focus on your own health, counselling, therapy. Learn to play guitar. Give myself time to do things that feel right in my puku. Yeah, I think that's brilliant. Key thing there maybe is time, finding that time. And connection to te ao Māori. So involved with marae, practice manaakitanga. I moved home to my ukaipo, connect back to the land, living in my whānau home, a place where my children and moko love to come back and reconnect. Kei reira te rongoā. So again, the same question, are there things that you do to minimise violence in your life? Of those who said no, some stated they don't experience violence, so there was some that continued through the survey who hadn't experienced violence. In my life in general, I'm not exposed to violence. Some stated that they are no longer in that violent situation. I'm safe now. And some simply said, after 20 plus years, my partner's passed away, I'm now safe. That's what it took for them to become safe. Again, maintaining safe environments, isolation, I think boundaries, stay close to family and friends. Again, this acceptance, normalisation and internalisation of violence. I accept that it is a part, normal or not, of some of the things I involve myself in. Successful healing and managing conflict. This was an interesting one. My husband used to be very violent towards me for the first 12 years of our relationship, but he sought help from family and men's groups, and there was no violence for 22 years. I think in there's an indicator of change is possible. Oh. And just on that, again, we see the similarity between those who said yes, they do things to minimise, and those who said no. So some of the strategies are the same. So again, we see how we've normalised some of these practices in our daily life. Another question, after experiencing or witnessing violence, have you made the decision to be non-violent yourself and to remove violence from your life? Which I thought was a good question. Because that's, you make that decision, make a stance, and then make the change. Can be a really key part of the healing process. So if no, why? Again, have never experienced violence. I already lived that way. I am ever mindful of the tauira of non-violence that was set by my tupuna e Parihaka. Readiness to protect, use violence if necessary. So some said, no, I haven't made that stance because actually, if it came to it, I would use violence to protect my whānau. I will be violent if I have to protect my whānau. And a number stated a kind of like a disillusion with the concept of being violence-free. Skepticism with this concept. It doesn't work that way even if you want it to. Again, the concept of acceptance, unavoidable internalization. I don't know how to stop or remove violence because it comes from the person I love. And comments around systemic violence and racism. We live in a society defined by class warfare and colonisation, and it would be dumb not to fight that. So those were some responses from those who said, no, I haven't made the decision to be non-violent and remove it from my life. These are some responses from those who said, yes, I have made that decision, and the follow-up question was, what prompted you to make that decision? Number one, out on top was children mokopuna, hands down. I want my son to grow up different than we did. Next up, and these are roughly in terms of how frequent the comments came out, doesn't align with own values. I don't need to have that power over another person. And a lot of them talked about manaakitanga and aroha. And I think, we talk about it a lot as Māori. We're required to describe our own foundational mata pono. Okay? But I think that's a good thing, because then they're explicit. I often compare it to tikanga Pākehā, and they're not explicit, they're implicit. They often, don't know. So I think there's a value in us knowing our own values. And a number of them talked about breaking the cycle. Why carry on cycles of trauma? Awareness of the impact. I see the way it has hurt whānau. And some reached the limit. I couldn't bear it anymore. And some acknowledged the ongoing work required. So it's not a bang, make a decision, everything's changed. Yeah, I work on it every day. Recognition of self-worth. I felt it was inhibiting me from being the best person I could be. Again, an acknowledgement of impact of colonisation and systemic racism, to stop the cycle of colonised aggression that caused the original sin within our people. And I think that's an interesting quote too. Hey? Hia te whakapapo te mahi tūkino. Te ao Māori, so again drawing on te ao Māori. All people are tapu and need to be treated with respect. It's not a part of our tikanga. Wanting to be free and to be Māori. Okay, so we've got a couple of graphs that look like this. And these are, so in general, how important are the following in your healing from the impact of violence? The green portion of each bar is very important, blue somewhat important, and orangey not at all. So these are ordered from left to right in terms of those that were indicated as very important. So how important are the following in your healing from the impact of violence? Up top, kāinga. Next, te tuakiri, so identity, whanaungatanga, wairuatanga, kaupapa whānau. Whānau, mātauranga, whakapapa, tūranga waiwai, tikanga Māori values, mahi, so having mahi, and te reo Māori. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that. I think, for me, an interesting one was te reo Māori. But hold that, because we'll have a, hold that thought, because we'll have a look in the next graph. It flips the other way. Oh, top 5. So another question, in general, how important are the following for the health of you and your whānau? So before it was for healing from violence, health of you and your whānau in general. Kāinga, whanaungatanga, tuakiri, whānau, mātauranga, wairuatanga, whakapapa, mahi, kaupapa whānau, tūranga waiwai, tikanga Māori values, te reo Māori. We had some talk yesterday about homelessness and poverty and the importance of that. So, see kāinga coming up first in both of these graphs. Top 5. Okay, and this one is a different question with a different set of possible answers. So we'll go through this one. Again, green are where it's been indicated very important. So the question is, how important are the following for a healthy future for Māori? Do I have oh yeah, got my circle. Up the top there, number 1, addressing poverty. Number 2, addressing racism. Honouring te tiriti. Normalising te reo Māori in schools. So remember that previous graph? Here, it's right up the top. And the next one says normalising te reo Māori in communities. Affirming mātauranga Māori. So those, I think it's at 5, 3, 4, 5, 6 there. That red circle there I think is really important. Because I think if we did all those things, we'd be leaps and bounds along our journey. Eh? And most, if not all, of the other things listed there would fall into place, would follow through. So I think this is quite a profound graph. Those things, addressing poverty, addressing racism, honouring te tiriti, normalising te reo Māori in schools and in our communities, affirming mātauranga Māori. So our tikanga takes, is there, is right there. And I think, this is just my opinion, I think the other things would follow through. So the other things are increased support for kohanga reo, resourcing and funding kaupapa, I think that's kaupapa Māori. School, yep, sorry, it's cut off. Decreasing incarceration of Māori, empowering Māori organisations, establishing a Māori health system, increased support for wānanga, so our 3 wānanga, divesting power to whānau hapu iwi and communities, greater focus on prison programs, addressing homophobia and abolishing prisons. So that's actually my last slide for today. Oh, I had a note of disappointment. I feel like I've kind of bombarded our rōpū here today. So mihi atu kia koutou for your aro, for your attention in these 2 sessions. I'm not finished yet, though. It's really interesting. So the last couple of days, seeing this research come to light and drawing on the expertise and experiences in the room, and you as a researcher, for myself, like I say, sitting behind the safety of my laptop most of the time, it's profound for me to see it all come together and draw on the different strengths of the different aspects of the research, but like I say, on everyone's experiences here. I think something from yesterday that really stood out for me, and I mentioned it earlier, is around the idea of power. And I think, and I keep that red circle there, because I do believe if we were in power, we would do that. They would be our priorities. Yeah, I do believe that. And I think one of the things, when we talk about power and power sharing, and Marama spoke a fair bit about it yesterday, shifting power. I think something that's often not acknowledged when we talk about power sharing is we don't fully acknowledge where the power sits and where it doesn't. Yeah? And to do that, we have to know what the power looks like. And then we have to show those who are in power, we have to show to them the power that they have. Because those in power, those who are privileged, are often blinded to the power that they have. And then we have to acknowledge, for a power sharing to happen, one group has to relinquish some of their power. And I think that's what's not often spoken about. I think we need to speak about it, we need to articulate it to make it really clear that that's what happens. That's what needs to happen. For a power sharing to happen, for a power shift to happen, the dominant group that holds the power needs to relinquish that power. So that was kind of a thought that came to me from Marama's kōrero yesterday, but that I carried through the whole of the day yesterday. Marama also spoke about the importance of achieving peaceful lives for everyone. So I wanted to hold those two thoughts. And I went, after our amazing kai last night, I went up to the hotel room where I should have been having a good moi before this big presentation, which I was terribly nervous about. But I wrote a thing, and I want to share it with you today to round off my kōrero, but I do believe we'll have time for questions and comments afterwards. So I've termed this a letter to the coloniser. A letter to the coloniser, what power looks like. Power looks like money. It looks like a contract, shaped the way we want it to be shaped with no end date because there is no end. So power looks like ongoing, sustainable, endless resource and funding. So in fact, power looks like no contract. It looks like a purse with no strings. Power looks like trust. It looks like turning up to a service and seeing yourself reflected there and knowing no matter what, they've got your back. It looks like not needing that service at all. It looks like that service not having a reason to exist. Power looks like a just justice system, an educational education system, a healthy health system. Power looks like not having to explain ourselves. It looks like defining ourselves for ourselves. Power looks like living our day-to-day lives fear-free, anger-free, violence-free, free of entrapment, systemic or otherwise. Power looks like freedom. It looks like joy. Power looks like privilege, like intergenerational flourishing. Hauora, toiora, waiora, paiora, oranga, aio. Power looks like choice. Power looks like voice. Power looks like living our tikanga, eating it, sleeping it, waking to it, loving it, nurturing it, being nurtured by it, seeing our tikanga everywhere and not seeing it because it is everywhere. Power looks like reo, reo, reo. Power looks like rangatiratanga. Power looks like what you, the Crown, have and what we, ngā tangata o te whenua nei, have a right to. Hand it over. Kia ora tātou.
Tēnā koe te tuakana. Kei te tuwhera te papa mo ngā pātai. We have any questions?
Kia ora. My name's Jude Simpson. I work for the police. But I just wanted to come in from a different angle, and I just wanted to say this. There's a lot of us Pākehā women raising Māori children. And if we're not, some of us aren't with the fathers, so we're trying to do it on our own. And this survey, I think, is wonderful, but I couldn't have done it because I'm Pākehā. And yet I've experienced this on behalf of my babies. You know, I've sat in a courtroom where I've had to be there, so I've been the voice for my moko when he's been going up against something, because I was afraid to let him go through it without me, because he would have been seen differently because he's Māori. I've sat in a DHB waiting room where my moko has been judged because he's been Māori, and I've been told there's nothing wrong with your moko. But I know that there was, but they weren't looking at him through the eyes that I needed them to look at him. Police, you know, and I wrote a list of all these places where my moko has been discriminated, and my son and my daughters. You know, so it makes it hard for us as well, because if we aren't connected to our child's dad or mother through their being Māori, then we stand alone. But they're Māori, so we need help. You know, when we ask questions, what does all this mean for my moko? I don't know, because I'm not Māori. Help us. But where do we go? You know, I raised my babies by myself. So when their fathers left, and the children's fathers, a few different fathers, so I had a bit of a colourful background, they were gone. They were gone. But my children are Māori. So how do I help them learn that side and be that side if that's what they chose to be? You know, I'm disconnected and I have nothing. And then my voice can't be heard, because where can it be heard? Because I'm Pākehā. But I tell you what, I've had to fight for my babies, and I have seen the way they've been discriminated because of the colour of their skin, and I'm like that bloomin', you know, that bloomin' lioness. Hey, you fight for your babies. And I've had to do that on behalf of them. And I will always do that till the day I die. So I just need to know, you know, there's a lot of us Pākehā ladies and some Pākehā men raising our Māori children. Where do we sit?
Kia ora.
Where do we sit?
Ai, ngā mihi kia koe. And I want to again go back to Marama's quote that she shared with us yesterday, he mokopuna, he tupuna. And maybe add to that too, he mokopuna, te mokopuna. Aha ko wai, he mokopuna, te mokopuna. And we all have a role in supporting our mokopuna to flourish the best they can, and to support those who are supporting our mokopuna. Nō reira, mihi nui kia koe.
Pātai.
Kia ora. This is a pātai. Might be a shotgun effect, and you find the question, but anyway. So in terms of power sharing, you know, it's about their intent. They know, right? We've informed them for years, for 40 years, you know, about te tiriti o Waitangi, rangatiratanga, what it means to us. And the UN acknowledges our version, you know. So it's about intent. What is their fear? They have a fear, you know, white fragility, Pākehā fragility. So here's my question. It's around your micro, you know, the micro effects of racism, you know, and the incremental effects, you know. And yeah, we're desensitised. We grew up with it. We could raise hands here, right? There'd be heaps of hands. You know, how long have you experienced it? Oh, you know, generalising our whole lives, right? And so we get desensitised and we pick our fights, right? Because how much energy can I give to it today, right? Anyway, here's the question. It's around the micro stuff. So, okay, Pākehā talk about reverse racism, which is a logical fallacy. It doesn't exist. Inverse racism, though. How that micro stuff affects some of our people, right? And it turns inward. Do you have a kōrero around that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's probably the saddest impact of colonisation, that we take on the negative messages and believe them ourselves. And in academic terms, that's termed internalised racism. And there's been a lot of talk today, and I know Graham talked about the importance of, you know, again, I'm paraphrasing, but maybe decolonising our minds. And I just want to share a quote that comes up to me quite often, and no doubt some of you know who it's from, but emancipate yourself from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free our minds. And so the impact of colonisation is that mental slavery, that internalised racism, where we come to believe those negative perceptions that are thrown at us from media, from the state, from all sorts of corners. But I think there's that healing process and that tipping process where we do and can become emancipated from those mental binds, and that's where healing happens. And, you know, and we're seen in the stats here, and we know that our tikanga, our reo, our taonga tuku ihoa is the answer to that emancipation. Yeah, kia ora, he pātai pai.
Tina koe. I was interested in the statistic that you had where social media was the second. I can't remember if it was around a question around deprivation. I kind of feel that's really alarming because the survey was taken with only those that were over 18 years old. And we immediately start thinking about our rangatahi and our tamariki that are in these spaces, unmonitored a lot of the time. So what I wanted to ask you is this an area that we should actually be immediately concerned about now? And that's at research level as well as practitioners, that this stuff, that our babies are now exposed to this. And this is probably the first measure I've actually seen. I don't know what research has been done.
I think the short answer to that is yes. I'm really concerned about what our babies are exposed to on social media and the emotional and our wairua impacts it has. So yeah, I do. I don't know if anyone else in the room knows of any specific research that's going on and the impacts of social media on our tamariki mokopuna, on Māori in particular. And I think if there's no one in the room that knows of research happening, then perhaps it's not. So yeah, I think it should be a priority. And sorry, I couldn't find the slide.